I'd like to ask
Yep.
you first about Afghanistan. What do you think you left there when you left?
Well, I think I left behind a lot of very desperate, frightened people who have no idea what the future of their country now looks like. It's not that everybody in Afghanistan liked the U.S. In fact, that's far from the truth. But there is still real deep concern, particularly in urban areas, particularly for women, about what life will be like under Taliban rule. The Taliban has said that it's changed, that it is more pragmatic and more mature and diplomatic. But so far, to be honest, we haven't really seen anything on the ground that would lend any credence to that declaration. And so I think there is a huge amount of concern about what happens, particularly as Afghans now face not just a political crisis, but potentially an economic crisis as well.
You talk about women. How was it to cover in Afghanistan and confront with the Taliban being a woman reporter?
I think in some ways it made my job easier because often as women in places like Afghanistan are dealing with groups like the Taliban, you're seen as a little bit less of a threat than maybe my male colleagues are. You're seen as more of a curiosity. The Taliban didn't really know what to make of me. There were plenty of instances where they were clearly flummoxed or perturbed by my presence, where they would ask me to stand aside or look away or cover my face, where they would refuse to talk to me. But for the most part, I think as a Western woman, one enjoys quite a privileged position that I want to emphasize. My Afghan female colleagues do not enjoy that privilege and face much greater threats when they are out on the streets and trying to do their jobs reporting.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the U.S. had any better option than pulling off the way Joe Biden decided to go ahead with?
I mean, you know, it's always difficult as a journalist to sort of give your opinion about what policy should be. I think that everyone who I spoke to in Afghanistan either wanted the U.S. to leave or at the very least understood that the U.S. could not stay forever in a war where there was so little sense of progress or inching towards anything that could be called a victory. So I think there was a broad understanding of that, but I do think there was a lot of disappointment and heartache at the way the withdrawal was executed, not just under President Biden's tenure, but going back to President Trump's tenure as well, because that's where the deal was made. And a lot of people felt that there weren't enough extractions or guarantees that the Taliban were forced to give in order for U.S. forces to leave, that essentially the U.S. had made it known that it was going to leave come hell or high water, and the only thing the Taliban needed to do in order to help see that through was to ensure that Afghanistan would never again become a safe haven for terrorists. But there was very little in terms of guarantees about inclusivity, about, you know, cooperation with the Afghan government. And so I do think there is still a lot of bitterness in Afghanistan about how the U.S. ended its role there.
Could you go back if you wished to?
Absolutely, and I am planning to. I hope to head back in the near future. I think it's really important right now that international media keeps telling this story and keeps a close eye on what's happening there. We've heard the Taliban talking the talk. Now is the time to see if they're going to walk the walk, and so far there are no indications that they actually are. But without the gaze of the world fixed on Afghanistan, there will be no one to hold them accountable for the discrepancy between their words and their actions. And so I fundamentally believe it's more important than ever, even as there is a natural easing of interest in this story globally and in the U.S., for journalists to continue to cover it, to keep pushing it onto the news, to make sure that those in power are held accountable, and that those people who maybe don't have a voice right now have their opportunity to show the world what's happening.
What do you feel your mission is once you're on the field, Clarissa?
I think there are several aspects to that. My primary mission is to shine a spotlight on something that's happening and to give people a feel for what it's like on the ground. You know, so often we listen to politicians and analysts talk about issues around the world, and they're using this geopolitical jargon, and it sounds very cold and abstract and intellectual. My job is to make people feel it, to help them get a sense of connection with the people on the ground. And my job is to give a voice to those people on the ground, to give them a platform that the world has a better understanding of what they're going through, how they see a conflict, how they're experiencing events on the ground. And so I think those are the two main objectives that I take most seriously in my reporting. Trying to humanize stories, allowing people hundreds of miles away to be able to connect, and putting that spotlight and giving that voice where it needs to be given.
I read that you kind of felt the call to be an international war correspondent after 9/11, and the withdrawal of the U.S. troops from Afghanistan, in a sense, closes that period, starting on 9/11 and now the pull-off of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. Did it feel in any way personal for you in that sense?
It definitely felt personal, and I'm sure it did for so many Americans around the world, and so many people around the world, international citizens. This is an extraordinary bookending of a very turbulent couple of decades, beginning with the 9/11 attacks. So many people felt called to service or called to participate or understand better in some way, shape, or form. And then we lived through two very bloody decades, two very bloody wars, countless drone attacks, terrorist attacks, an enormous amount of service and sacrifice, Guantanamo Bay, some of the great stains on America's legacy. And to have this all end with a rather ignominious departure and the Taliban in control once again is a very profound statement about mistakes that have been made, lessons that have been learned. And I also think it's an inflection point. It's a moment where people have a choice now to sit and think as Americans about who do we want to be? What have we learned from the past? What's our next move? How does the world see us? It's a really important time, it seems to me, just as an observer, as a journalist, to have that moment of reflection and to really think about what it was all for.
Mm-hmm. When you decided to be an international correspondent, you were thinking about covering mostly wars or not only wars?
I think I was always drawn to conflict because I'm drawn to the most extreme crises, the most extreme breakdown of communication, the most extreme examples of dehumanization. But there was never a sense that I was exclusively interested in conflict. I moved to Russia as an intern for CNN in Moscow when I was 22 years old. I studied Russian and French and Italian, and I lived in China for 2.5 years and traveled extensively over Asia. I mean, to me, the world is endlessly fascinating and endlessly thrilling. It's not that I am specifically called to cover a conflict. Mm-hmm. And yet I can't ignore the fact that so often I do find myself coming back to war zones and coming back really honestly primarily to the stories of ordinary people who are living amid the chaos and amid the crossfire.
Mm-hmm. In fact, one of your previous coverages was in India from the impact of the coronavirus, right?
Yeah, and that was absolutely one of the more intense and the more harrowing stories I have covered. To see the incredible dignity of the Indian people in this moment of extreme pain and struggle, where you literally had people dying on the streets, hospitals running out of oxygen, a total failure of the government to provide a sort of public health information that would allow people to make better decisions about how to avoid catching COVID, how to avoid spreading it, whether or not to go to the hospital. It was almost like a perfect storm of just terrible things happening at the same time. And as a journalist, you felt very strongly that you had to do justice to the horror of this moment so that people around the world would pay attention.
Clarissa, you talk a lot about empathy. What about fear? What about fear of getting killed in the middle of the war? What about fear of your own health when going to India? How does fear play in your job?
I always tell people that if you're not scared, you're stupid, because fear is a really important, it's a really important emotion and a visceral physical sensation that actually informs our decision making in difficult and distressing times. And so you should feel fear and you should listen to your fear. How you respond to your fear is another thing altogether, whether you let it panic you or whether you try to use it to get out of a dangerous situation if you're in one. I would just say that when I covered India, I had both vaccines. I was very careful about washing my hands, about wearing a mask, about wearing proper full protective gear when I was inside a COVID ward in a public hospital. And I think the same is true when I cover conflict. I'm actually very cautious and do everything within my power alongside my team to ensure that risks are mitigated to the best of our ability.
And becoming a mother, did in any way change your sense of fear or the way you, I mean, your work also demands you to travel a lot, to be a lot of time out away from home.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really hard, and and I don't think it's helpful to pretend otherwise. It's hard, it's a juggling act. I'm dropping balls all the time. My children are the most important thing in the world to me, and I love my work and I want them to be proud of it, but I do have to balance that with the responsibilities of being a mother, and there are risks that I would have taken before that I'm not willing to take now, and there are assignments that might last 6 weeks and I just can't do those anymore. I can't be away from my children for more than 3 weeks, and even 3 weeks it's painful. It hurts. It's hard. But you do the best that you can, and my little boys are really lucky, and I'm really lucky to have a big support network of wonderful friends and family, and I think you do the best you can.
Yeah, do you still feel like women, we still have to make more concessions than men while working? Or do you think it would be different if you were a man?
I think it is different when you're a man, and I'm not sure if you're really allowed to or supposed to say that anymore today, but I'll give you an example. You asked me the question about how being a mother has changed things, and I think that's a really valid question. But I also think it's very interesting that my male colleagues who are parents don't get asked that as much. How has it changed your calculation being a father? I do think we get that a lot as a mother, a lot more as women, as mothers doing this job. And similarly, when I'm in the field and I'm on a satellite phone in northern Syria trying to organize my son's doctor's appointments and play dates from the field while he's in London, I don't see my male colleagues who are parents doing that as much. So I don't want to make huge generalizations, and obviously we've come a long way and things have changed a lot. But on a personal level, I definitely feel that being a mother and being out in the field and away from your family for periods of time, it's hugely challenging on many levels, and some people are still uncomfortable with it.
Yeah, it's not only how you feel about it, but also how the rest of the people look at you on that situation, right? Or maybe you're still carrying your home obligation.
There's a lot of judgment. There's a lot of judgment.
And you have your own. We all have enough with our own judgment, so as to have also the other people's judgment.
That's
right?
exactly. I'm like, we're hard enough on ourselves as mothers. Right. We don't need other people on top of it.
So what would you like to cover next, Clarissa?
Well, I definitely want to keep covering what's happening in Afghanistan because, as I said, I think it's important that the world stays focused on that issue and continues to hold the Taliban accountable for their actions. I'm looking forward to seeing what the G20 summit is going to be like at the end of October. I think that the G20 have a lot of really important and complex, thorny issues that they're going to have to get into together. And I think it'll be interesting to see how President Biden presents himself. It's, you know, the G7 was one thing, and now it'll be interesting to see how things look a few months later, post-Afghanistan. I think there's a sense that things are not quite as rosy as they were before. So it'll be interesting to see that as well. And then beyond that, I mean, so many stories that I continue to have a huge amount of interest in, not least what's happening in Russia at the moment. We have parliamentary elections getting underway there now. The Russian opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, continues to be held in a penal colony. So I'm always focused on investigative stories in Russia as well.
Going back to Afghanistan, do you feel there hasn't been enough awareness in the world in relation to the danger women are put into now under the Taliban regime again? I mean, women that were working, studying, having their own independent lives, and then having to go back to those rules. We don't really know how hard they will be, but their life, it's not the same it used to be from now.
I've actually been really gratified to see how many people around the world have been so focused on the issue of the threat that so many women in Afghanistan now face, the potential of losing their rights, of being subjugated, once again, removed from public life. It's been kind of inspiring to see how passionate people are about that story and how much they care about it and how much they connect to it. What I think will be really important going forward is to ensure that people remain engaged, that they are still you know, taking an interest and, in a sense, on a certain level, fighting for those Afghan women by ensuring that their story stays in the news as time goes forward. Because I think that the reality is we're not really going to see the truth of what's going to happen in Afghanistan overnight. This is going to take months and months to unfold, and the world can't take its eye off the ball here.
Do you think as your audience, who you're talking to, the United States, a global audience, what do you think? Who do you think you work for?
I think I'm very lucky to, I think, working for CNN and having an international platform as well as a domestic American platform. I feel very privileged to have a truly global audience. And actually, I was just looking on my Instagram followers the other day, and it said that I have a huge following in a city called Guayaquil in Ecuador, which, like, who knew? I had no idea. But I find that so exciting, and that really energizes me and inspires me and makes me more curious to, you know, spend more time in Latin America and South America. And so I love that rare privilege we have at CNN of being able to talk to a truly global audience and connect with people from all over the world.
Because sometimes it's difficult to pick up U.S. attention towards international issues, right?
Yeah, it can be. I mean, I think especially under the Trump presidency, America was going through a full-blown crisis and was therefore quite naturally very much focused inwards and on the chaos that was playing out in the White House. And it was absolutely more difficult to sort of break through that and get international stories out into the world. I think perhaps because of my upbringing, you know, I'm half British and half American. I grew up half my life here in the UK, half of my life in the US. My father moved to Hong Kong when I was 14. And so I always had this very privileged international upbringing. And I think maybe because of that, my outlook is more one of, like, I'm a global citizen as opposed to I am British, I am American, I am this or that nationality. And again, that's why it's great to work at CNN International, because you really have the opportunity to do both.
Yeah, because sometimes Americans feel that they're doing the world well by their international actions, and then you go on the field and the perception is completely different, and you have to kind of be able to tell that story, right? Which is confronting totally with what many Americans feels what's actually happening, right?
Absolutely. And, you know, that's a big part of why I became a journalist, and what I started to realize so fundamentally when I was first working in the Middle East, for example, was this huge chasm between how Americans saw themselves and their role in the world and how the rest of the world perceived America and its actions. And, you know, both in terms of America having a sort of slightly myopic view and understanding of the way it's perceived, but also in terms of the rest of the world sometimes not having a fully rounded out understanding of America's actions or what motivates the US in certain situations. And so in a sense, at the beginning of this journey, it was about learning on a more profound level to understand how my role as a young American in the world, but also trying to act as a kind of translator between different worlds, right, and improve what I felt was this complete crisis of communication between different worlds.
Mm-hmm. You've seen so much pain, Clarissa. Are you optimistic?
I always tell people that I've seen the worst of humanity, but I've seen the best of humanity too. And unfortunately, we don't often get to talk about the best of humanity on the news. We're more focused on the worst of humanity. But there are so many moments of kindness and human connection and sacrifice and courage and real beauty that I have been privileged enough to witness in the various conflict zones and countries that I have visited over the last 15, 20 years. And I think that's what keeps me going. That's what keeps me optimistic, is knowing that, you know, you can't have the worst without the best. You can't have the dark without the light. And it's about keeping that, trying to find that balance and not allowing one to consume you completely.
Because things have been getting worse and worse, right? All these years since you started out as an international correspondent.
I mean, I think there's been some really dark moments. I can't say that it's getting worse and worse, because things do get better as well. But definitely, the more you do this job, the longer you do it for, the more you're exposed to incredible suffering and trauma and pain and violence. And that does take a toll. And that is something that you have to take a moment to really think about and navigate if you want to keep doing this job for a long time. Because when you're young, you feel kind of invincible, like nothing can stop you and nothing can get you down. But as you get older and a little bit wiser, you start to realize that self-care and being in touch with what's going on spiritually, emotionally, is hugely important and really will ultimately determine how long you're able to do this job, and whether you're able to also function and have a healthy, normal life as well.
And last, Clarissa, how do you think our job has changed all these years? Technology, internet, Twitter, for good, for bad?
Yeah, I mean, it's changed enormously. I mean, you can't, there's so much good. We have so many new voices that have emerged. There's been this incredible democratization of information, and people from all over being able to share their voices, their experiences, and that's invaluable. That has made the landscape of news and information so much richer, so much deeper. At the same time, of course, when you open up and you have that cacophony of different voices, you also create a scenario where there are people who want to undermine that, who want to undermine the idea of truth, who want to undermine values that people stand for, and that can be really dangerous. And I think we're in a pivotal moment right now with this sort of deluge of misinformation and disinformation, where we really have to rise to the challenge and keep doing the job, but we can't be wrong. We have to be right all the time. We have to make sure our facts are right. We have to make sure we're being fair. We have to make sure we're being inclusive and giving as many of those voices a chance to express their personal opinion and experience of any given subject. So it's a more complex and challenging time, I think, to be a journalist than ever before, but I also think it's more rewarding.
You also have media taking sides, right? Polarization. How do you, and journalists not doing our jobs, right? Because we're taking sides, which is not our job.
I think, there's there's an absolute temptation right now to take a stance, to get political, because that goes down really well on Twitter and Instagram, and you might get a lot more followers from taking that kind of an attitude. I try to tune out the noise when I'm in the field. I think that all of it's a distraction, whether it's praise, whether it's criticism, whether it comes from the right, whether it comes from the left. My job when I'm in the field is to focus on what's in front of me, is to talk to people, to learn, to communicate, to give a sense of the swell of the scene. And everything else, honestly, is just noise.
Thank you so much, Clarissa. We know you are always short on time, so I appreciate
a lot your time. Thank you. I really enjoyed our
time.
conversation.
Me too, Clarissa. Thank you very much.